Not every wrestler can be as fortunate as Terry Funk and have a career that spans 6 decades. No, sometimes when a performer comes along, they're for one reason or another only destined to be a wrestler for a short period of time. Of course, the reasons for this can vary from person to person, but the end result is always the same, and that means having a short run in the business. But who are the biggest examples of short careers in wrestling history? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at today. And where better to start than with Magnum TA? That's right, many modern-day fans may not be familiar with the name Magnum TA, and that's a shame because while his career was short, during his time in the ring, he was able to prove himself as a true legend of the industry. How did he do this? Well, by getting over big time as a babyface during the Territory era in Jim Crockett Promotions. And considering this is the same company which housed the likes of Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair, the fact he was able to carve out such a role for himself says a lot. Yes, there was a period back during the mid-80s where it looked like the Virginia native was going to be the next big thing in wrestling, the man to fully take up the mantle of top star of the entire industry, at least outside of Hulk Hogan and the WWF. Now that's exactly why, despite only being a few years into his career by the time 1984 came around, Jim Crockett decided to push him to the moon by having him beat Wahoo McDaniel for the United States Championship. And it should be noted that back then, the US title wasn't what it was today, a mid-card belt which doesn't hold a huge amount of importance. No, for many performers during this era, it was as hard-earned and prestigious as the world title. So for Magnum to hold it while he was still a rookie said a lot about the money his bosses saw in him. It's just a shame then that after defending this belt against all comers, with this run including probably the greatest cage match of all time, him versus Tully Blanchard at Starrcade 1985, Magnum TA's career was cut short when on October 14, 1986, he was involved in a serious car crash. And that crash was so bad it near paralyzed him, with it damaging his spine to the point that doctors would never clear him to wrestle again. That's right, instead of becoming the next big thing, the fan favorite would become one of wrestling's greatest what-ifs. Seriously, who knows what could have happened if he had not had that fateful accident? In fact, you could argue the only reason Sting got pushed to the level of top babyface a few years later was because there was still a void left over from Magnum. But Magnum TA wouldn't be the only great what-if of this era, because around the time he was having to contend with the fact that his wrestling career was over, another notable figure in wrestling was coming and going in the WWF. Who are we talking about here? Why, Tom McGee, of course. Now, we're sure you've all heard the story by this point. On October 7th, 1986, a young powerlifter who bears an uncanny resemblance to current-day Kenny Omega gets a chance to have a tryout match of sorts with WWF during a house show in Rochester. And it's there that he has such a good showing, Emperor Palpatine quickly begins making plans to have him be his next top babyface. Of course, pretty quickly after this though, the boss realizes the error of his ways, as after seeing McGee in subsequent bouts, he realizes he doesn't have the star he thought he did on his hands. And so like that, the weeks-long odyssey of Tom McGee as WWF's top babyface in waiting comes to an end as he disappears into the night, presumably to return to his hometown of Winnipeg and secretly father a certain best bout machine. So what happened to make Vince McMahon think he had such a big deal in McGee in the first place then? Well, it all came down to who he was in the ring with that night. Yes, this was the famous match where the Canadian was put up against Bret Hart, and because the Hitman was so good, he was able to take a rookie with little to no experience and make him look like the second coming of Hulk Hogan. The only problem with this though was that no one else was Bret, and so once Tom McGee had to wrestle other people, his limitations were quickly exposed. And at that point it became apparent he wasn't as good as he first appeared. But even if it was always going to end this way eventually, it's still wild just how close the bodybuilder came to actually being the next guy in WWF. But alas, instead of rising up the ranks following his star-making bout with the excellence of execution, it was game over for the man who would be king, as from there, he'd disappear into the area of myth until that famous match was once more unearthed decades later. Of course, by the time this tape was being rediscovered, there were a whole host of other stars having short-lived runs of their own, and one of the most prominent at that point was AJ Lee. Really, the biggest issue you could have with AJ Lee is that she came a little too early to be fully appreciated. Had she entered the industry just a few years later, in fact, she would have been able to reap the rewards of being part of WWE's Women's Revolution, putting on great bouts against the likes of Sasha Banks and Bayley on the regular. But that's not the way things happened for her, because instead, she came around at the tail end of the Divas era. Not that this held the New Jersey native back though. No, despite this being a time period where women didn't play a large role on the show, AJ was able to carve out a big role for herself through sheer talent and personality. That's right, few other women were over enough in WWE at this point to merit being put in a prominent spot every week as the general manager of Raw, as well as doing the dual duty of holding down an entire division as champion, all while she was also getting involved in programs with the likes of CM Punk, Daniel Bryan, Kane, John Cena, and Dolph Ziggler? No one. That's who. So it's just a shame that this would all ultimately be short-lived for her, as in 2015, right around the time the women's revolution was really picking up, she'd announced she was done for good. Why was she done? Well, it was a combination of injuries and the bad atmosphere created by her husband's exit from the company the year prior, with all this creating a situation where AJ felt like she just couldn't carry on anymore. So like that then, her time came to an end right when it should have been shifting into the next gear, and that will always leave fans feeling like there's some unfinished business with her to some degree. Could she still return at some point and finish her story, so to speak? Sure, there's always the possibility, but sadly the same thing won't be happening for our next subject, another great women's star, Chyna. No, when it comes to Chyna, her passing away in 2016 makes it impossible for us to see her in the ring again, and that's a terrible shame because during the short run she did have, she was arguably the most game-changing woman to ever do it. Sure, early pioneers like Mildred Burke and Mae Young might have laid the groundwork, but in modern times, fans had never seen anyone dominate women's wrestling like Janie LaRue did when she came along in 1997. And the reason she was so dominating was because, as a bodybuilder, she was honestly bigger than a good portion of the men, with this being exactly why she was able to beat up so many of them as the bodyguard for Hunter Hearst Helmsley. Of course, it should come as no surprise that before long, the Rochester native would be winning men's titles, the Intercontinental title specifically, with her being the first and, to date, only woman to ever do this. Hell, at one point there was even talk of Chyna winning the world title, so over she was getting, but in the end, this was deemed a step too far for bookers at the time. And sadly, soon after that, it would be time on Janie LaRue's WWF career, as after a contract dispute, she'd spend a brief period in Japan, all before effectively retiring from the ring only 5 years into her career. Yes, she would make a brief return again in 2011 when she appeared at a TNA taping, but that was so short-lived, it has since gone forgotten by most. And a few years after that, any hopes of a WWE return would be ended when she tragically passed away. What a crime this was then, because had things worked out differently, we could be talking about Chyna as being an even bigger star than she was. And in some ways, the same thing could be said about our next subject too, Sha OHare. Sure, Sha OHare was never as big a star as the ninth wonder of the world, but he did have a lot of potential, and this was something which was evident as far back as his origins working for WCW in 2000 and early 2001. That said, it wouldn't fully become apparent how much potential the rookie had until 2003, as this was the point that after jumping to WWE during the invasion, he was given an all-new character, that of the Devil's Advocate. Who was the Devil's Advocate? Well, he was a figure who had seemingly endless potential, as his whole thing was playing mind games with his opponents Bray Wyatt style by convincing them to act against their best interests, doing things like stripping naked in the ring or having an affair. You can probably see what could have been done with such a character as a top-level heel then, and how far the Atlanta native could have gone with it if he were given the chance. But unfortunately for him, before his full potential could be realized, his character would be nerfed when he became little more than the muscle for a returning Rowdy Roddy Piper, with this pretty much killing any momentum he'd built up. And with Vince McMahon apparently losing interest in him because of that, it would only be a year later that OHare would be released from his contract altogether. Still though, at least a man of his talents would be able to find success elsewhere, right? Maybe in TNA or Japan? Well, no, because despite having a brief run in Japan, and at one point even getting to wrestle a young Hiroshi Tanahashi, come 2006, the person who at one point looked like he could be WWE's next big breakout star was hanging up his boots for good, only 7 years into his career. And considering he's never even hinted at a return in the years since then, we think it's safe to say we've seen the last of Sha OHare in the ring at this point. Could he have had a longer run if he'd wanted? Of course he could. But things don't always work out the way we hope they might. After all, a lot of people saw a lot of potential in our next subject before his career ended early too. Who are we talking about this time? Who else but Kenny Dykstra. That's right, believe it or not, but when the Spirit Squad were first introduced to WWE audiences in early 2006, it wasn't Dolph Ziggler who people expected to be the breakout star of the group. No, the plan was very much for Kenny Dykstra to fill this role, and the reason for that was because he appeared to be the most naturally talented of the bunch, someone who had it all in terms of the look, the in-ring skills, and the charisma. So what happened then? Well, the Spirit Squad, ironically enough. Yes, it appears being brought in to play the comedy mid-card role of male cheerleader did a number on not only Kenny's confidence, but also his desire to continue on in the ring after a while. And that's why once the group ran its course in 2006 and he was shifted over to the singles division, he ended up doing little of note, as the passion was clearly no longer there. Sure, he was still good enough and he still got TV time, but by then, it was clear the idea of Kenny Dykstra being a main eventer was a distant memory. And so that was why in 2008, he'd end up being cut from his WWE contract, with him at this point moving over to the likes of Dragon Gate USA and TNA and having short runs there. And once those runs were over, he'd retire completely, leaving all his potential to remain a what if, as his now former tag partner Dolph started to rise up the ranks faster and faster. Just think how different things could have been in that alternate universe though, where it's the Massachusetts native who reaches this point instead and proves himself to be a top guy material either in the Fed or elsewhere. He was certainly good enough to fill such a role when motivated, so there's no reason it couldn't have happened under different circumstances. But of course, circumstances were what they were, and so instead he'd be relegated to a footnote of WWE history, much in the same way that our next subject has Gene Snitsky. Sure, he could have been a little more had he hung around a little longer, but with a WWE career which only lasted about 5 years, he did manage to do a lot in that short period of time. That's right, there were some memorable moments during the run for this Pennsylvania native, moments such as him punting a baby, proclaiming it wasn't his fault, and of course, showing his very particular tastes for women's feet. Unfortunately though, Snitsky's time was always going to be short-lived, as with him not being what you would call a great wrestler or a great promo or a great character in general, there was a very definitive limit on his possibility. So, after feuding with the likes of Kane for a while and then being shipped over to the dreaded WWECW brand to try and give them a boost, he'd call it a day in 2008. Yes, it's true that he made a few appearances elsewhere in the years following, appearances in companies such as TNA and MLW, but those were more glorified cameos than anything else, and certainly not a full-blown return to action. No, in the end, the fact remains that once he left the Fed towards the end of the 2010s, the era of Snitsky came to a close. So maybe we should just be content to leave the memories alone with regards to him as an in-ring performer. And we'd argue the same thing could be said about our next subject too, another performer whose time came and went in short order during the Ruthless Aggression era, heading into the PG era. That's right, it's time to talk about the Boogeyman. Now, we were probably all scared of the Boogeyman to some degree when we were growing up. After all, he was a figure of nightmares, so it's no surprise WWE wanted to capitalize on that then during one of their most cartoonish periods, as it fit right in with the vibe of the time. The only problem though was that Marty Wright, the man behind the gimmick, was well into his 40s when he got started. And with him not having the benefit of being a late-in-life prodigy like Diamond Dallas Page or Dave Bautista, this meant he was always going to have a short ticking clock running on his career from day one. Still, that didn't mean he wasn't able to have a nice run for himself during the time he had, as what basically amounted to a glorified mascot for the company, much in the same way that R-Truth or Danhausen fill similar roles today in their own respective promotions. Hell, the Boogeyman was even able to get a WrestleMania bout against Booker T, something which helped him to keep a presence in the company all the way up until 2009, at which point the fun and games finally came to an end and he closed the book on his full-time career after 5 years. But even if it did come to an end here, the nature of the Boogeyman character has meant he's been able to make numerous cameo appearances in the years since, usually on a Halloween episode of either Raw or SmackDown, as he once more spooks out a member of the heel roster. And given this isn't exactly taking a toll on his body, we wouldn't be surprised to see him continue to appear in such a manner for years to come yet. Just don't expect to see him get any more WrestleMania matches though. No, it's going to be brief ins and outs for Martin Wright going forward, but that's one better than our next subject, as ever since she left in 2004, we haven't heard much at all from Sable. And that's particularly interesting because prior to this, Sable was arguably the biggest star on the women's roster in WWF, maybe even bigger than Chyna. Seriously, while many fans may dismiss her now as being a relic of a bygone era, during the turn of the millennium, Rena Miro was hugely over, with her pops at certain points rivaling that of Steve Austin and The Rock. And it all soon reached a point where, feeling like she wasn't being compensated well enough for the role she was playing in helping WWF go mainstream, she started making bigger demands with regards to her pay. Unfortunately though, such demands didn't work out well for the Jacksonville native, and so it was that after 3 years of getting a lot of people to stay tuned in to Raw on Monday nights with her segments, Sable was gone. And while she would eventually come back for a couple short runs in 2003 and 2004, things were a lot different this time around, as she was never quite as big a star as she was the first time around. So, instead of being the focus like she was during the late 90s, this time Rena Miro was more of a footnote, with the most notable thing she did during her run then being meeting her eventual husband, Brock Lesnar. And after Brock left in 2004 following issues of his own with the WWE schedule, the former women's champion would follow him right out of the door as she left for a second time, this time never to return. Yes, while her run in wrestling may have been short in the grand scheme of things, the fact we're still talking about it today is a testament to just how big of an impact she left. It's just a shame the same can't be said for our next subject then, because his career had the dual negative of being both short-lived and not as eventful as it should have been. Who are we talking about this time? Monty Brown. Now, it's not like Monty Brown was bad or anything, no, quite the opposite. It's just he never had enough time in the business to reach his full potential. And he also had some success as a football player, playing for both the Buffalo Bills and the New England Patriots between 1993 and 1996, but sadly, that same level of success would never really transfer over to the squared circle in the same way. No, there, the Michigan native failed to find as big a foothold in wrestling, despite getting signed by TNA during the early days of its run, back when it was still an NWA-affiliated territory. It didn't matter if he was getting to take part in high-profile matches, like the one he had against then NWA World Champion Jeff Jarrett, he never managed to get to the high points that fans thought he might achieve. So when his time with TNA came to an end in 2006, and he instead signed with WWE to join their WWECW brand under the new name of Marcus Corvon, many fans thought this might finally be his time to make it to the top of the card, as he was made the newest member of the New Breed stable. How did this work out for Monty? Well, not great, unfortunately, with him never really getting over in a big way. And so it really shouldn't be a surprise then that after losing a match to CM Punk on the June 19th, 2000 episode of ECW, he'd be cut from his contract. And after this, he'd retire from the wrestling business altogether, but at least this short run made him eligible for a spot in today's video, so we can all remember him again for a while.